I have seen this pattern before. The moment when an empire discovers that what it believed was strength was actually dependence. What it thought was dominance was actually permission. What it assumed was loyalty was actually mercy that could be withdrawn. Most people believe they are watching a trade dispute, two neighbors arguing over tariffs and market access, a temporary disagreement that will be resolved through negotiation and compromise. They see tweets and press conferences and assume this is politics as usual between allies who will eventually return to their comfortable arrangements. They are wrong. What they are witnessing is the moment America discovered its empire was built on Canadian mercy, and that mercy has been quietly, systematically withdrawn. For 80 years, the United States operated under a fundamental delusion. They believed Canadian cooperation was inevitable. They assumed Canadian resources would always flow south. Canadian markets would always remain open. Canadian strategic patience would always absorb American political theater. This assumption became so embedded in American strategic thinking that it was never questioned, never examined, never recognized as the foundation upon which American continental dominance rested. The Romans made the same mistake with their foederati. The Spanish made it with their colonial territories. The British made it with their dominions. Every empire eventually begins to confuse cooperation with submission, partnership with vassalage, voluntary alliance with conquered territory. The pattern is always the same. The dominant power becomes so accustomed to deference that it stops recognizing deference as a choice. It begins treating voluntary cooperation as tribute owed, strategic patience as weakness to be exploited, diplomatic restraint as confirmation of subordinate status. The empire starts believing its own propaganda about natural hierarchy and inevitable dominance. But empires built on voluntary cooperation carry within them the seeds of their own transformation. The moment the cooperative partner decides to stop cooperating, the entire structure reveals itself as an illusion. What appeared to be imperial control was actually sustained consent. What looked like dominance was actually interdependence, disguised by one side's willingness to accept a smaller share of the benefits. The Romans discovered this when their Gothic foederati stopped defending the frontier and started crossing it. The British discovered it when their dominions stopped automatically following London's lead in 1914 and started demanding equal partnership. The Americans are discovering it now as Canada systematically withdraws the cooperation that made American continental dominance possible. This is where history always turns. Not through invasion or revolution, but through the quiet realization that what appeared to be strength was actually sustained by someone else's choice to allow it. The pattern reveals itself in stages. First comes the imperial overreach, the moment when the dominant power pushes too hard, assumes too much, demands what was previously given freely. In February 2025, America chose to treat its most reliable partner as a security threat. 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, 15% on Canadian energy, the classification of Canadian aluminum and steel as threats to American national security. The psychology of that decision reveals everything. To declare your largest trading partner, your military ally, your neighbor, across the world's longest undefended border. A security threat is to admit that you never understood the relationship at all. It is to confess that what you thought was control was actually dependence disguised by Canadian politeness. But empires never recognize dependence until it is withdrawn. American strategic planners had built their continental dominance around assumptions that were never tested because they were never challenged. The assumption that Canada would always absorb the cost of American political theater. The assumption that Canadian resources had no alternative markets. The assumption that Canadian patience was infinite. Those assumptions died the moment Canada said no, not through government decree or diplomatic protest, but through the collective decision of ordinary Canadians to stop participating in their own economic subordination. Canadian travel to the United States collapsed by 37% in a single month. Cross-border shopping, a tradition for millions of families, simply stopped. 68% of Canadians planned to avoid American goods for at least 18 months. This was not organized resistance. This was the organic response of a population that finally understood the relationship had always been voluntary. And voluntary relationships can be terminated. The immediate economic consequences revealed the structural reality that American policymakers had spent decades ignoring. Border communities that relied on Canadian customers saw foot traffic drop by over 60%. Hotels in Montana and North Dakota reported occupancy rates not seen since the 2008 financial crisis, $4.2 billion in lost revenue in 6 months. But the real damage was happening in sectors that American planners had never considered vulnerable. Energy. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. Not just any oil, but heavy crude specifically designed for American refineries that cannot simply switch to alternatives without massive retooling costing tens of billions of dollars. This is the classic vulnerability of every empire that mistakes geographic convenience for strategic security. The Romans built their grain supply around Egyptian wheat, never imagining Egypt might one day serve other masters. The British designed their industrial revolution around American cotton, never considering that American independence might disrupt that flow. Every dominant power eventually builds critical dependencies around the assumption that cooperation equals control. American energy infrastructure was designed around the certainty of Canadian supply. Pipelines, refineries, distribution networks, all optimized for Canadian heavy crude flowing south without interruption. This was not just economic efficiency, it was strategic blindness. The entire American energy system became hostage to a relationship that America never bothered to maintain properly because they assumed it was guaranteed by geography, rather than sustained by goodwill. When Trump imposed a 15% tariff on Canadian energy, expecting Ottawa to absorb the cost, he triggered an economic boomerang that revealed the true structure of continental energy dependence. Refineries in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin saw input costs spike by $18 per barrel overnight. They passed this cost directly to American consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in swing states were paying an additional 41 cents per gallon solely due to the Canadian energy tariff. The political consequences were swift and brutal. Republican governors in Ohio and Michigan publicly broke with the administration. The American Trucking Association called the tariffs economically suicidal. When your own party's governors denounce your signature policy, you have lost control of the narrative. While America doubled down on chaos, Canada began demonstrating what strategic patience looks like when applied systematically. Following Trudeau's resignation, Mark Carney implemented what can only be described as a masterclass in economic warfare conducted through infrastructure development. The $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program was not stimulus spending. It was strategic capital expenditure designed to permanently restructure the Canadian economy away from American dependence. $340 billion over 5 years to build east-west trade corridors bypassing American markets entirely. $280 billion for critical minerals processing, ensuring Canada would add value rather than export raw materials. $180 billion for the Arctic Gateway Initiative centered on Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill had been dismissed as a northern outpost, the polar bear capital of the world. Carney understood what American strategists missed. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America directly connected to the continental rail network. As climate change opens northern shipping routes, Churchill becomes the most strategically valuable port on the continent. This is how civilizational advantages shift without fanfare or recognition. Venice became a maritime empire not through military conquest, but through geographic positioning at the intersection of European and Eastern trade routes. Amsterdam overtook Lisbon as the center of global commerce, not through war, but through superior infrastructure and strategic patience. London displaced Amsterdam through the same quiet accumulation of geographic and logistical advantages that competitors recognized, only after it was too late to counter. Churchill represents the same kind of civilizational shift, disguised as a regional development project. What appears to be Canadian infrastructure investment is actually the construction of a new global trade geography. The Hudson Bay Railway, that single line of steel running nearly 1,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to the Arctic coast, is being transformed from a regional freight line into the most strategically important transportation corridor in North America. The Americans built their continental dominance around the assumption that North American trade would always flow through their ports, their cities, their transportation networks. They never imagined that climate change would open alternative routes that bypassed their infrastructure entirely. They never considered that their northern neighbor might possess geographic advantages that could make American logistics networks obsolete. The geometry is undeniable. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers using Churchill rather than traditional routes through American ports. 12 days of transit time, $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage. In an industry where margins are measured in pennies per ton, this represents revolutionary competitive advantage. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canada was serving notice that North American trade no longer had to flow through American-controlled choke points. The market responded immediately. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23%, potash prices spiked 31%. But Carney's strategy extended beyond infrastructure. While Trump alienated traditional allies, Canada quietly built alternative partnerships. Comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union worth $244 billion. Bilateral deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand targeting 700 million consumers with combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. Even the relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision. In November 2025, Carney met with President Xi in what both leaders described as a strategic reset. Without endorsing China's political system, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all sides while serving as proxy for none. This neutrality allowed Canadian companies to maintain access to both American and Chinese markets, while their American competitors were forced to choose. The results speak for themselves. By the end of 2025, Canadian exports to the European Union were up 34% year over year. Exports to Asia increased 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports declined as international buyers found alternative suppliers not subject to political uncertainty. The most telling indicator came from private equity flows. Foreign investment in Canadian logistics and infrastructure jumped by 340% in the final quarter. Global capital was voting with its money, betting that Canada, not the United States, represented stability and growth in North America. But perhaps the most sophisticated element of Carney's strategy was the timing. He recognized that all these economic maneuvers were building toward July 1st, 2026, the mandatory USMCA review where all three countries must decide whether to renew the agreement for another 16 years. Trump had viewed this date as a weapon, assuming 18 months of tariffs would bring Canada crawling to the table desperate for any deal. Instead, as the review approaches, panic is visible not in Ottawa, but in Washington. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings were supposed to rubber stamp Trump's tough stance. Instead, they revealed corporate revolt. 147 American business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of farms. The Automotive Policy Council showed that single car parts crossed the border 7 times during production, with each crossing taxed at 25%, adding $1,400 to American-made vehicles. Ford cited supply chain disruptions for $1.4 billion in losses. GM closed 2 Michigan plants due to expensive Canadian components. Trade economists began drawing historical parallels to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which triggered global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. This brings us to the core insight that explains why America's strategy has backfired so completely. Leverage in international relations is not determined by the size of your economy. It is determined by alternatives. For 80 years, the United States maintained dominance over Canada by ensuring Canada had no choice but to sell to American markets and buy American goods. That monopoly is now broken. Canada has built alternative supply chains, alternative customers, alternative infrastructure. Mark Carney can walk into the USMCA review with a folder full of signed trade deals and a unified country behind him. He can look across the table and say they want free trade and partnership, but they do not need to be subjects. The United States, meanwhile, faces a $1.6 trillion hole in its economy if USMCA collapses. Half that trade involves intermediate goods that fuel American manufacturing. Unlike Canada, the United States has not spent the last 18 months building alternative relationships. They have spent that time alienating existing partners. The mathematics are brutal for American negotiators. The United States imports $429 billion worth of goods from Canada and Mexico annually. American manufacturers designed production around North American supply chains. Replacing those relationships would take years and cost hundreds of billions. Canada, by contrast, has already begun that replacement process. When the USMCA review begins, Canada will negotiate from strength, not desperation. What we are witnessing is not just a trade dispute. It is a historical correction that has been decades in the making. For too long, Canada accepted the role of resource colony, shipping raw materials south and buying back finished goods at premium prices. The pandemic showed the vulnerability of that model. Trump's tariffs provided the political justification to break free from it. The infrastructure being built today is permanent. The trade relationships being forged are sticky. Even if a future American administration offers to return to the old arrangement, the diversification will not simply reverse itself. The Canadian executive who spent 2 years developing relationships in Vietnam is not going to abandon them for the convenience of American buyers. More importantly, trust has been broken. In international relations, trust is the most valuable currency. When you treat a partner like an enemy, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, you do not get to simply reset when it becomes convenient. What we are seeing is the birth of a new kind of power structure. Not dominance through military force, but influence through geographic advantage, resource control, and strategic positioning. Canada controls the world's longest coastline, 20% of global freshwater, and the keys to Arctic passages that will define 21st century trade routes. The warming Arctic has transformed Canada's northern coast from a frozen barrier into a highway. The Northwest Passage, blocked by ice for most of human history, now offers shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which can be blocked or controlled by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters. Every ship that refuels at Churchill, every ton of wheat loaded in Hudson Bay, strengthens Canada's legal claim to Arctic sovereignty. It transforms theoretical map lines into physical reality. The United States finds itself in the unprecedented position of being economically dependent on a country it chose to treat as an adversary. American refineries need Canadian oil. American manufacturers need Canadian aluminum. American agriculture needs Canadian fertilizer. This dependency was manageable when Canada had no alternatives. It becomes strategic vulnerability when Canada can sell to the highest bidder in global markets. The irony is profound. In attempting to make America great again by reducing dependence on foreign nations, Trump actually increased American vulnerability by creating a more independent Canada. The quiet neighbor to the north, content to remain in America's economic orbit, has been pushed into building its own gravitational field. As we look toward 2026 and beyond, other middle powers are watching Canada's strategy with intense interest. Australia, Brazil, South Africa, all resource-rich nations that have chafed under great power dominance, are studying the Canadian model of strategic diversification. The lesson is clear. In a multipolar world, exclusive alignment with any single power, even a friendly one, is vulnerability. True sovereignty requires alternatives. Canada has spent the last 18 months building those alternatives, while the United States spent that time destroying relationships. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how quietly it occurred. While American media focused on political drama, Canada was signing trade deals, building ports, constructing the infrastructure of independence. The world woke to discover that the junior partner in North America had become a peer competitor. This is not the end of the US-Canada relationship. Geography, culture, and economic integration ensure the two countries will remain connected. But it is the end of the assumption that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. The new reality is mutual dependence between equals, not the colonial extraction model that defined the relationship for generations. Canada has proven that a middle power armed with smart strategy and patient execution can reshape the balance of an entire continent. As we move forward, the question is not whether Canada will remain America's closest ally. The question is whether America can adapt to having a true partner rather than a subordinate. The answer will determine not just the future of North American trade, but the broader pattern of how great powers interact with their neighbors in an increasingly multipolar world. History does not punish intentions. It only records outcomes. And the outcome of America's attempt to discipline its most reliable partner has been the creation of its most formidable competitor. Canada has proven that America's empire was built on Canadian mercy. And mercy, once withdrawn, is not easily restored.